Max Holloway, one of the most decorated fighters in UFC history, is stepping into a defining moment in his career, and the landscape around him is already shifting, with Netflix set to launch its first ever live MMA event on May 16th, and several UFC legends already making their move to that card. Holloway's name now sits firmly among those leading the charge into this new era. So let's break down everything that led to this moment. On March 7th, 2026, Max Holloway walked into the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas to defend his BMF championship against Charles Oliveira. In the main event of UFC 326, it was supposed to be a coronation, a statement fight, the kind of performance that would bulldoze every remaining doubt about Holloway's place at 155 pounds and catapult him toward a shot at the undisputed lightweight title held by Ilia Topuria. The narrative was practically pre-written. Holloway had already beaten Oliveira in their first meeting way back in 2015, a bizarre 99-second TKO that ended when Oliveira suffered a shoulder injury. Over a decade later, the rematch was supposed to be Holloway's chance to prove that first result was no fluke, but nothing went to plan. Charles Oliveira arrived at UFC 326 as a fundamentally different fighter than the man Holloway had beaten all those years ago. Do Bronx soundly controlled and wrestled Holloway across 5 rounds, grinding him against the cage, dragging him to the mat, and suffocating any attempt at the free-flowing striking exchanges that have defined Holloway's career. When the judges' scorecards were read, Holloway lost the BMF title by unanimous decision. The loss itself was hard enough to swallow, but the commentary that followed was savage. Arman Tsarukyan publicly declared Holloway's career done, blasting his wrestling deficiencies, and claiming the former champion had looked terrible. The criticism wasn't entirely unfounded. If Holloway's takedown defense can't hold up at 155 pounds, the lightweight division is full of physically powerful grapplers, names like Tsarukyan, Benoit Saint-Denis, and Mateusz Gamrot, who would exploit the same weaknesses Oliveira exposed. This was the second consecutive setback in Holloway's trajectory. Before the Oliveira fight, the 34-year-old had suffered his first career knockout loss to Ilia Topuria at UFC 308 in October 2024, a devastating result that ended his tenure as a featherweight. He'd rebounded by beating Dustin Poirier at UFC 318 in July 2025, effectively retiring his old rival, but suffered a hand injury in the process that sidelined him until 2026. So here stands a man who holds the UFC records for most significant strikes landed, 3,655, and most total strikes landed, 3,907. Records where no other fighter is within 1,000 of either mark. A man who Fight Matrix ranks as the 3rd greatest featherweight of all time, and the 8th greatest pound-for-pound fighter in MMA history. A man who enjoyed a 3-year title reign at 145 pounds from 2016 to 2019. And now, after 2 losses in his last 3 fights, the vultures are circling. The question on everybody's lips, what does Max Holloway do next? And this is where things get interesting, because while Holloway figures out his future inside the UFC, an entirely new force has emerged outside of it, and it's pulling UFC fighters toward it like a magnet. On February 17, 2026, Most Valuable Promotions and Netflix dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the combat sports world. They announced Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano, a colossal MMA showdown that would serve as Netflix's first ever live MMA broadcast, and MVP's inaugural MMA event. The event was slated for Saturday, May 16, 2026, at the Intuit Dome in Los Angeles. Rousey herself said it plainly, "Me and Gina Carano are gonna throw down in the biggest super fight in women's combat sport history." And she wasn't exaggerating about the scale. The event would stream live globally on Netflix at no additional cost to its 325+ million members. No pay-per-view fee, no additional subscription, just one fight card reaching more eyeballs than practically anything in MMA history. The Rousey-Carano announcement was seismic enough on its own, but then the dominoes started falling. On March 16th, Netflix revealed that former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou would return to MMA to face Felipe Lins on the same card. Ngannou, the man who left the UFC in a bitter contract dispute, crossed over to boxing, and won a PFL championship in 2024, was back. He had taken to social media with a statement that captured the mood. "While the world was busy talking, I was busy evolving. Then came the third bomb. Nate Diaz, the Stockton legend himself, signed on to face Mike Platinum Perry in a 5-round welterweight bout on the same card. Diaz, who had left the UFC after submitting Tony Ferguson in 2021 and built his own promotion, Real Fight Inc., was choosing MVP and Netflix over a return to Dana White's Octagon. In fact, Dana White himself admitted that he'd had a meeting with Diaz weeks prior. But Diaz received an offer from MVP that he couldn't refuse. By the time the full card was announced on March 24th, it featured 11 fights in total, an embarrassment of riches that included former UFC heavyweight champion Junior Dos Santos, undefeated flyweight Mohamed Mokaev, former Bellator welterweight champion Jason Jackson, and even Aline Pereira, the sister of Alex Pereira. Fans immediately started comparing the card to the UFC's own flagship events. Some were saying it outright, better than UFC White House. The underlying message was clear. MVP was founded in 2021 by Jake Paul and Nikisa Badarian, with a fighter-first ethos, and they were now backing it up. Their partnership with Netflix had already produced the Jake Paul vs. Mike Tyson event in November 2024, which shattered records as the most streamed sporting event of all time, with 125 million viewers. Now they were moving into MMA, the UFC's home territory, with a swagger and a checkbook that made fighters pay attention. And if you think the UFC wasn't feeling the heat, think again. The UFC scheduled counter-programming against the May 16 Netflix event with UFC Vegas 117. Meanwhile, Ronda Rousey herself started openly disparaging the UFC, claiming the promotion was at risk of losing its premier status. And Jake Paul declared, "UFC is dying. MVP is here to take over." So there it is. Netflix and MVP are raiding UFC's roster and building something legitimate. Ngannou left. Diaz left, Rousey came back, but not for Dana White. The pattern is unmistakable. And with Max Holloway coming off back-to-back setbacks and sitting without a title, the speculation was inevitable. To understand why the idea of Holloway leaving the UFC even gained traction, you have to understand his history with the promotion when it comes to money. Holloway has never hidden the fact that he believes he's underpaid. Back when he became the undisputed UFC featherweight champion after defeating Jose Aldo at UFC 212, he immediately pushed for a new contract before his first title defense. He said it himself, "I'm just asking for a fair shake." You see a lot of these guys, a lot of these other champions making what they're making. I'm not trying to take anything away from them, but I feel like I'm one of the more exciting fighters under contract in the UFC. That frustration has simmered for years, and if you look at the numbers, it's not hard to see why. Holloway's overall career earnings are widely estimated at over $12.5 million through mid-2025, excluding undisclosed pay-per-view shares. While that sounds like a fortune, compare it to the money flowing in other combat sports ecosystems. The Paul vs. Tyson event in November 2024 drew 125 million viewers on Netflix, and those fighters were reportedly compensated handsomely for the eyeballs they attracted. Ngannou has competed across boxing, PFL, and now MVP, diversifying his income streams in ways UFC fighters historically cannot. Nate Diaz received an offer from MVP that even Dana White acknowledged he couldn't refuse. Meanwhile, Holloway, a man who holds UFC records that may never be broken, saw his estimated total pay for the UFC 326 headliner land between $2 million and $4 million, including win bonuses, sponsorship payments, and discretionary bonuses. For a main event in one of the biggest sports promotions on the planet, that number tells a story, and the financial landscape of the UFC itself is shifting underneath everyone's feet. The UFC struck a massive $7.7 billion agreement with Paramount that fundamentally changed how events are broadcast, eliminating the pay-per-view model entirely and moving everything to Paramount. Even Conor McGregor, the sport's biggest box office draw, has publicly insisted that the Paramount deal voided his contract with the promotion. If McGregor, the man who headlined the 5 highest-earning pay-per-view events in UFC history, is unhappy with the new financial arrangement, what does that tell you about how the rank-and-file roster feels? The tectonic plates are moving, and fighters are watching Ngannou, Diaz, and Rousey walk into the Netflix MVP machine and get paid at a level that the UFC's current structure may not match. For a veteran like Holloway, 34 years old, born in Honolulu and raised in YNA, an area known for fist fighting, a man who started training in kickboxing at 15 out of Team Ruthless and clawed his way to the top from nothing, The financial calculus has to be running through his head. Every fighter has a window, and windows close. But here's where the plot thickens, because there's another massive factor pulling Holloway in a completely different direction, and his name is Conor McGregor. McGregor hasn't fought since suffering a broken leg in his TKO loss to Dustin Poirier at UFC 264 in July 2021. That's nearly 5 years away from the sport. There have been numerous obstacles and false starts. The failed UFC 303 booking against Michael Chandler, the rumors about the UFC White House event, the deleted Instagram posts. But now, something has actually materialized. The Nevada State Athletic Commission has officially approved a UFC event at the T-Mobile Arena on July 11th, believed to be the UFC 329 International Fight Week event. McGregor himself has confirmed it, posting on Instagram that the rumors are true and that he'll be returning to the cage. And according to MMA journalist Ariel Helwani, one of the most reliable sources in the business, Max Holloway is the frontrunner to be McGregor's opponent. Holloway has made zero effort to hide his interest. Before UFC 326, he told TMZ Sports he'd love to run it back with McGregor, calling it a fight where you'd be stupid as hell not to take. After his loss to Oliveira, he doubled down on his YouTube channel. Conor got one over me. He's talking about coming back. I'm coming off a loss. It would look pretty fun to get that one back with him. The history here is deep and personal. Holloway faced McGregor on August 17, 2013 at UFC Fight Night 26, back when both men were young, unproven fighters at featherweight. McGregor won via unanimous decision. It was the first fight where the Irishman failed to score a finish, partly because he injured his knee early in the bout and employed a surprisingly wrestling-heavy style. That loss put Holloway on a 2-fight skid and dropped his UFC record to 3-3. But what happened next defined his legacy. Holloway responded by going on a massive winning streak that established him as an all-time featherweight great. He's never had the chance to avenge that loss. I want to get back everybody that got one on me, and I never had the opportunity with him. Holloway stated during an interview with the UFC. In the weight class issue, Holloway doesn't care. McGregor is expected to return at welterweight, 170 pounds, and Holloway has never fought there. But he told fans, if he doesn't want to cut weight, then I don't want to cut weight. We can do it at any weight, to be honest. He even invoked the BMF title. I have the BMF title, and the last time I checked, the BMF title was at 170 pounds before. A McGregor fight is the one thing that could keep Holloway firmly planted in the UFC. McGregor's 4 fights are among the top 5 highest-earning pay-per-view events in UFC history. And even without the old pay-per-view model, a McGregor comeback card on Paramount would be the single most watched event in the platform's history. The payday would be unlike anything Holloway has ever seen, but not everyone is convinced this matchup will materialize. Chael Sonnen has publicly stated he's confident it won't be Holloway, arguing that since the fight would be at 170 pounds, a weight where Holloway has never competed, the UFC would likely hand the assignment to a natural welterweight like Ian Machado Gary instead. So here's the tension. Holloway wants the McGregor fight. The McGregor fight would pay him enormously and keep him in the UFC. But if it doesn't happen, if the UFC goes a different direction, what then? A 34-year-old former champion coming off a loss without a belt, without a clear path to the title, in a division stacked with grapplers who've exposed his weaknesses. That's the kind of position that makes fighters start looking at their options outside the octagon. So let's address the title of this video head on. Has Max Holloway officially quit the UFC and signed for the Netflix MMA event? No, he has not. As of right now, Holloway currently competes in the lightweight division of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. He is under contract with the UFC. His most recent fight was the UFC 326 BMF title bout against Charles Oliveira on March 7, 2026, at T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. He lost that fight but has not been released from his contract, has not publicly requested his release, and has not announced any departure from the organization. In fact, the evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. Holloway is reported as the current frontrunner to face Conor McGregor at UFC 329 on July 11, 2026. During International Fight Week, Ariel Helwani has reported that it would take something disastrous for McGregor not to appear on that card, and Holloway's name is firmly at the top of the list for the opposite corner. Holloway himself has said, "Sign me up." Now, the Netflix MMA event on May 16 is real. It's Most Valuable Promotions' first MMA card, headlined by Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano. with Francis Ngannou versus Felipe Lins and Nate Diaz versus Mike Perry. It's stacked, it's legitimate, and it is absolutely creating pressure on the UFC by pulling former UFC stars like Ngannou, Diaz, and Junior Dos Santos onto its card. But Max Holloway's name does not appear on that card. Not in the main event, not in the co-main, not on the prelims. He is not signed with MVP. He is not scheduled to compete on Netflix's platform. What is true is that the landscape of MMA is shifting in a way that makes stories like this feel plausible. When Francis Ngannou left the UFC over a contract dispute and is now fighting on Netflix for MVP. When Nate Diaz turned down a UFC return to accept MVP's offer. When Jake Paul declares UFC is dying. MVP is here to take over. It creates an environment where any big name leaving feels possible. And Holloway is at a genuine career crossroads. He's 34 years old. He's coming off a loss where critics said he looked so bad and declared his career done. He's lost the BMF title. His path to the undisputed lightweight championship is now murkier than ever, with Ilia Topuria set to defend against Justin Gaethje at the UFC White House event on June 14th. But here's the reality. Max Holloway has spent his entire professional career inside the UFC. He debuted at UFC 143 on February 4th, 2012, as the youngest fighter on the roster. That's 14 years of building his legacy inside one organization. He's accumulated 23 UFC wins, multiple records, and the kind of reputation that makes him one of the most beloved fighters in the promotion's history. The McGregor rematch, a fight that could be worth more than any single bout he's ever had, is dangling right there. And if that fight falls through, there are other massive matchups at 155 pounds. A rematch with Oliveira, a potential showdown with Sarukian, or even another crack at Topuria down the road. Could the day come when Holloway leaves the UFC? In this era, with MVP and Netflix writing enormous checks and offering global platforms with no pay-per-view barrier, anything is possible. The competition is real, and it has a way of prodding the UFC into action. But that day is not today. Max Holloway has not quit the UFC. He is not signed with Netflix or MVP. What he has done is position himself for one of the biggest fights in UFC history, a rematch 13 years in the making against the sport's most magnetic star. For now, Blessed remains in the octagon, but make no mistake, every fighter in that locker room is watching what happens on May 16th at the Intuit Dome. And if the Netflix MVP machine proves it can outshine the UFC in both spectacle and paychecks, the conversation around Holloway and every other star under the UFC banner will only get louder.